I still remember the exact moment it began, though at the time, I didn't know it was the start of anything at all. I told a small lie that morning, one I thought harmless. By noon, I realized it had already spun a web I couldn't climb out of. The repair shop smelled like motor oil and old leather, the kind of place where sunlight barely filtered through the grimy windows. I was hunched over a bike chain, trying to look like I knew what I was doing when she walked in. The kind of walk that doesn't announce itself, but somehow makes the room shift. Confident, measured, but with a softness in the way she moved, like she belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. She wore a light scarf, slightly rumpled, and a blazer that suggested she was here for business but didn't need to prove it. Her eyes, sharp, brown, perceptive, caught mine from across the room, and I felt a little too exposed under their quiet inspection. "I'm looking for a replacement part," she said, voice steady, almost teasing in its calmness. Something small, but apparently vital. I nodded, my words trapped somewhere between professional and awkward. Yeah, I can." I stopped because I realized I didn't actually know if we had it. My lie slipped out before I could think. "We definitely have it." Her lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile. That half curve that could mean anything. Suspicion? Amusement? I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to. She followed me to the shelves, hands brushing lightly against the metal frames as if she weren't just looking for a part, but measuring the world around her. I caught her glance on me again, longer this time, curious, almost teasing, and my stomach clenched. I tried to focus on the part, on anything but the fact that she was older, impossibly composed, and somehow had already managed to make the room shrink to just the two of us. When I finally handed her the piece, her fingers lingered over mine for just a moment, long enough to spark an awareness I didn't know I was capable of. I felt my pulse quicken, my thoughts scattering in a dozen directions, none of them useful. "You were right," she said, sliding the part into her bag. "You did have it." There was warmth in her voice now, just enough to make me think she could sense the lie beneath my words. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, it unnerved me. The awkward pause that followed wasn't filled with words, but with something heavier, something I couldn't name. The kind of silence where even the dust motes seemed to hover in anticipation. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth went dry. Instead, she tilted her head, almost imperceptibly, and gave a faint, private smile, the kind you keep to yourself. Then she was gone, leaving me standing behind the counter, heart thudding, hands sticky with oil, unable to stop thinking about the way her fingers had brushed mine and the way she'd looked at me like she already knew the secret I was too scared to admit, to anyone, even myself. I didn't realize it yet, but that fleeting contact, that single moment of shared, wordless recognition, was the first thread of the web I'd already walked straight into. And even now, I can't stop replaying it. The tilt of her head, the soft exhale, that tiny, private smile that burned itself into my memory. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. The office was quiet, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, the kind of hum that makes you notice every small sound. I was organizing a stack of invoices when she appeared in the doorway, carrying a folder that looked heavier than it had any right to be. "Could you give me a hand with this?" she asked, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. But the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her calm. I set down the papers and stepped forward, gently lifting one end of the folder. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a second, the poised exterior cracked just enough for me to see it. The weariness, the quiet tension she carried like a second skin. Her hands were slender but strong, the kind that seemed capable of holding the world together without effort. As she adjusted her grip, I noticed the faint tremble at her knuckles, a tiny crack in the armor she wore so carefully. She caught me staring and gave a faint, tight-lipped smile, quickly masking the moment before I could comment. We moved the folder to her desk, our fingers brushing accidentally, again, and she jerked slightly, eyes darting away. I could see her shoulders tense, and the slight sigh she tried to hide was almost audible. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but something in her expression stopped me. This wasn't the moment to intrude. Instead, I simply held the folder steady and let her set it down. She leaned back in her chair and ran a hand through her hair, a small gesture that made her look human in a way that startled me. Her laugh broke the silence a moment later, soft, reluctant, almost self-conscious, at something she muttered under her breath. It wasn't directed at me, but I felt the echo of it, warm and fleeting, and I wanted to make it last. "Thanks," she said finally, her tone clipped but not unkind. She rubbed her eyes briefly, and I noticed the faint circles beneath them, the kind that spoke of late nights and unspoken worries. I hesitated, debating whether to say something, to acknowledge the fatigue I could see so clearly, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I just smiled lightly, letting the silence stretch between us. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if deciding whether to trust me with more than a simple thank you. I noticed how she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, intimate movement she didn't mean to perform for anyone else. My pulse quickened, but I kept my own gestures minimal, careful not to crowd the space she seemed to guard so fiercely. Then, for a brief instant, her gaze met mine again, lingering longer than necessary. There was something unspoken in that look, a flicker of vulnerability she didn't share with anyone else. My throat went dry, but I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The air between us was thick, charged in a way that felt dangerous and inevitable all at once. As she turned back to her desk, I caught a glimpse of the soft exhale she released, part relief, part tension, and I realized I hadn't noticed it before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made my chest ache. I stayed where I was a moment longer, watching her settle into the rhythm of her work, the quiet pull of something forbidden lingering in the space between us. I left her there, absorbed in the faint rustle of papers, carrying with me the memory of that tiny, delicate gesture. A soft exhale, a fleeting glance, a tension only I seemed to notice. And I knew, without words, that I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it. The office was empty that night except for the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rattle of papers in the storm rattling the windows. Rain lashed against the glass, making the world outside blur into streaks of gray. She was still at her desk, the soft lamplight catching the curve of her face, making it look both sharper and more fragile at the same time. I'd come in under the pretense of finishing some paperwork, but the truth was, I hadn't wanted to leave. The quiet, the rain, her presence, it felt like a loophole in reality I didn't want to escape. I hovered near her desk, pretending to sort through files, but my eyes kept drifting. She didn't notice, or maybe she did and simply chose not to. She sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose, and I thought I saw the faintest tremor in her lips. I wanted to ask if she was tired, if she wanted to step away, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I offered the smallest gesture, hand hovering near the edge of her desk, ready to help if she dropped the stack of papers she was rearranging. Our fingers brushed, just slightly, and I froze, heart hammering in a way that made the hum of the AC vanish. She glanced at me, eyes sharp and unreadable, and for a moment, the air between us thickened. I caught a hint of something, a trace of hesitation, maybe even longing, but it dissolved before I could name it. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would make her lean closer, to let the tension stretch into something more, but I didn't. I couldn't. The moment was perfect and terrifying all at once. And then, her phone buzzed, cutting through the fragile cocoon of silence. She glanced at it, her expression tightening. "It's nothing," she said quickly, almost to herself, but I knew the pause meant otherwise. External pressure always seemed to find her. Calls, messages, responsibilities. The world insisted on intrusion just when something delicate tried to breathe. I felt that weight pressing on both of us, and I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to step back, to let her have it. We returned to our tasks in a tense rhythm, close but distant at the same time. I noticed the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she focused, the subtle way her shoulder tensed when the wind rattled the windows. I wanted to reach across the desk and brush it away, to make her forget for a second, but I restrained myself. This wasn't mine to fix, not yet. And then, in the quiet lull between thunder and rain, our knees touched under the desk. Just a brush, accidental, meaningless, and yet it felt like a spark catching on dry brushwood. Her glance met mine again, that careful, fleeting look that promised questions she didn't voice and confessions we didn't dare speak. My pulse spiked, the storm outside echoing the storm inside me. We stayed like that for a long moment, silent, aware, suspended. I wanted to lean closer, to let the tension dissolve in some dangerous, perfect way. But the phone buzzed again, a reminder that the world existed beyond the charged little bubble of our proximity. So I didn't. I stayed still, letting her gather herself, letting the storm do what it would. And yet, even as the rain drowned the city, my chest ached with the near action we didn't take. The almost touch, the almost confession, the almost impossible that lingered like smoke between us. The hallway was empty, except for the muffled sounds of the city outside. Cars splashing through puddles, wind rattling loose shutters. We'd been sitting in near silence for almost an hour, papers scattered across the conference table like a feeble excuse for work. I hadn't meant to linger, but I couldn't seem to leave. She hadn't either. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers tapping lightly, almost rhythmically, like a heartbeat I could feel more than hear. I tried not to stare, but each flicker of her gaze caught mine, drawing me back into the quiet tension that had grown between us over weeks, small moments stacking into something I could no longer ignore. Finally, she spoke, soft, measured, but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" I swallowed, unsure whether to answer. The room seemed too small for words, too loaded with the weight of unspoken things. "Here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though my chest throbbed. "Yes," she said, and I noticed the faintest tremble in her shoulders. "I mean, I don't even know what this is anymore." She stopped, her fingers curling slightly, and I felt the tension coiling around both of us like a rope. "What are we doing?" The words hung between us, fragile and sharp. I wanted to speak, to explain myself, to make it something simpler than it was, but every explanation felt like a lie. I looked down at the papers, pretending they mattered, but I could hear my own pulse in the silence. She leaned back slightly, eyes not leaving mine. The lamplight caught the curve of her face, highlighting the faint lines around her eyes, the weariness I'd glimpsed before, now rawer, more exposed. I wanted to reach out, to brush a loose strand of hair from her cheek, to say something that might make it less frightening, but I stayed still. Her gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, as if she were offering me a small mercy in the middle of all this tension. "I can't pretend anymore," she whispered, almost to herself. "And I don't know if I should." I wanted to ask what she meant, to clarify, to hold her gaze and bridge the gap between fear and desire, but I couldn't find the words. All I could do was watch her, heart pounding, feeling the fragility of the moment like glass under my fingers. For a long stretch, we said nothing. The silence was louder than any confession could have been, pressing against us, demanding honesty in its absence. I realized then that whatever this was, whatever had been building, small gestures and glances, lingering touches that weren't quite meant, I could no longer ignore. Her voice came again, low and trembling now. "I'm tired of wondering if I'm making a mistake, or if I'm just afraid of being alone." She swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "I don't know how to stop thinking about you." It wasn't romantic, not in the sense of softness or comfort. It was raw, messy, human. A crack in the armor we'd both been wearing, exposing uncertainty, longing, fear, all tangled together. I felt the room shift, felt the fragile equilibrium of our unspoken tension tip, and I knew that after this, nothing would be the same. She looked at me, gaze steady now, and whispered, almost breaking, "I don't know if I want to stop." The rain had eased by the time I returned to the office the next morning, leaving the city wet and gleaming under a pale, hesitant sun. I found her at the same desk, hunched over a cup of coffee, the steam curling around her like a fragile shield. She began, then stopped, fingers drumming lightly on the rim of the mug. I waited, unsure whether to intrude or stay silent. Her eyes met mine briefly, carrying a weight that made me catch my breath. "I wasn't always like this," she said finally, voice low, almost confessional. "I mean, I've been through things. Lost someone important. It changes you, makes you cautious, makes you careful." I nodded slowly, letting the words settle. I didn't want to push, but I wanted her to know I was listening. The room felt smaller somehow, tighter around the two of us. Yet every detail became more vivid. The faint crease near her temple, the tremor of her hand as she lifted her cup, the way her scarf shifted when she exhaled. I thought I'd never, I don't know, recover from it, she said, staring into the coffee as if searching for answers there. The vulnerability in her tone made my chest tighten, a reminder that she wasn't invincible, no matter how composed she appeared to the world. I wanted to say something comforting, but all I could do was quietly reach for a photo on the corner of her desk. A small, slightly faded image of a younger man and a woman, smiling in sunlight. My fingers hovered over it, and I felt an ache in my chest that wasn't entirely mine. "That was him," she said softly, following my gaze. Her voice trembled, just a little, like she was letting a secret slip she hadn't planned to share. "My husband. He didn't make it. And I didn't know how to move on for a long time." The words hit me in a way I wasn't expecting, not like a storm, but like a subtle tremor under the floor, shaking the foundation I'd been standing on. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge the distance, but I stayed still, letting the moment breathe, letting her decide how much she could share. I remembered the first time I saw her laugh, how it had been careful, restrained. Now it made sense. The fatigue, the hesitation, the protective walls she carried, they weren't just habit or personality. They were armor forged from loss and heartbreak. I finally spoke, voice barely more than a whisper. I'm glad you told me." There was nothing more to say, nothing grand or heroic. Just honesty, quiet acknowledgement of the gravity she'd carried silently. She looked at me then, eyes glistening, and for the first time, I saw the faintest flicker of relief, or maybe hope, slip across her face. It wasn't a smile, not yet. It was something subtler, human, fragile, the acknowledgement that she didn't have to carry it alone for a moment, even if the weight of it lingered. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, trembling on the edge of something new. And as she returned to the photo, tracing the outline of a face I would never forget, I realized the web she carried wasn't just about me. It was about everything she had survived, everything she had lost, and somehow, even in that quiet vulnerability, it drew me closer. Her voice broke the hush again, soft and almost inaudible. I didn't think I'd ever feel anything like this again. The office was quieter than usual that evening. Papers had been filed, phones silenced, and the usual hum of the city felt distant, muffled by the thick, humid air after the rain. We found ourselves alone again, not by plan, but by the sort of coincidence that always seemed to follow us. She leaned back in her chair, tiredness etched into the lines of her face, and I noticed it immediately. The way her shoulders sagged just enough to let me see she didn't need to pretend. I sat across from her, keeping my hands folded, trying to respect the fragile balance between closeness and restraint that had taken weeks to reach. We spoke in short bursts, fragments of conversation that mattered less than the silences between them. Each pause carried weight, a quiet acknowledgement of everything unsaid, of the tension that had built like a tide neither of us could ignore. "I'm glad you stayed," she murmured, almost to herself. Her eyes, usually so controlled, softened, revealing exhaustion, relief, and something I couldn't name. I nodded, letting the words hang. "I wouldn't have left," I said simply, and it was true. I didn't need to explain why. She didn't need to either. There was a long stretch of quiet after that, just the faint sound of rain dripping from the eaves outside. I noticed the subtle way she rubbed her hands together, a habitual motion that made her human, fragile, alive in a way that words could never capture. I reached out slowly, almost cautiously, resting my hand on the edge of hers. She didn't pull away. Her fingers twitched, brushing against mine for the briefest moment, tentative, testing, acknowledging. That small contact, so simple, so ordinary, was enough. Enough to say, without speaking, that we'd crossed the threshold into something inevitable, something earned through weeks of tension, hesitation, and quiet observation. She exhaled softly, leaning back in her chair, and I realized she wasn't pretending anymore. We were just two people, flawed and cautious, sharing the same space. navigating the same unspoken truths. The web of lies, near confessions, and fragile secrets hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It had led us here, to this moment of quiet understanding. I didn't say her name. She didn't say mine. It wasn't necessary. Our eyes met, and there was an unspoken agreement, a mutual decision to inhabit this fragile, delicate closeness without forcing it into words or grand gestures. She moved slightly, letting the warmth of my hand touch hers fully, the smallest possible intimacy. I felt her inhale, a sound so soft it barely reached me, and I knew that, for the first time, we were both exactly where we needed to be, without promises, without declarations, without certainty, but fully present. The room seemed to shrink around us, safe and quiet, filled only with our shared space and the faint hum of life outside. It was enough, finally enough. And as the rain ceased and the first hints of evening light spilled through the windows, she let her head rest against her palm, her hand brushing mine in the smallest, humanest gesture of all. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just existed there together. It's been months since that evening, though the memory hasn't faded. I find myself replaying it in quiet moments. The soft light of the office, the subtle brush of her hand against mine, the way silence became louder than any words could be. Time has a way of smoothing edges, but it doesn't erase the intensity of what we felt or the lessons it left behind. I've noticed small changes in myself. Patience where there was once impulse, awareness where there was distraction, a quiet understanding that connection isn't always about declarations, but about presence. She's changed too, in ways that aren't flashy or obvious. There's less armor, just enough space to breathe, to laugh fully without hesitation, to trust the moment without overthinking it. Watching her, I realized that love, real, flawed, human love, doesn't need fireworks or perfect timing. It exists in the small, earned spaces we create together, in the breaths shared and the silences that speak volumes. Sometimes I catch her watching me with that careful curiosity, and I smile, remembering how it started, with a lie, a glance, a small, fleeting brush of fingers. Nothing about it was dramatic, and yet everything changed. The web that once trapped me has become a bridge instead. It wasn't about rushing or conquering fear. It was about showing up, noticing the small things, and letting vulnerability exist without apology. And somehow, in that slow, quiet process, we learned what it means to lean on someone without losing ourselves or each other. I still think about that first day, the spark of something unspoken, the hesitant touches, the shared laughter under stormy skies. It all led here, a subtle, grounded love that feels as natural as breathing, yet as precious as anything I've ever known. And maybe that's the lesson, that love doesn't have to be explosive to be real, that intimacy can exist in a look, a touch, a shared silence, and that some of the strongest connections are the ones you build carefully, day by day. So here we are, still learning, still noticing, still present. Not perfect, not flashy, but undeniably ours. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of the messy, fragile, beautiful journey that brought us here. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?